mechanic service, but he also owns vast plantations around Kisangani. This is Kisangani in the heart of the Congo. And you see that this poor guy is just absolutely, trying to earn $2 pushing cassava leaves on an old beat-up bicycle or charcoal or whatever it is. If he earn, he'll earn $1, maybe $1, working all day long. Maybe it takes him a week to make $1, because on those plantations where he went, they were making $1 a week. No, it was $1. It was 500 francs. I better check that information because it wasn't a day, and I think it was more than a week. In any case, it's not much money, and it's a lot of suffering. But the guy that runs this Belgo Congo has a lot of plantations around Kisangani, and he was contracted by AFRICOM, meaning the Pentagon, to build the first base for AFRICOM in Kisangani, which has been built now in the last year in Kisangani. And he didn't bid on that. He was just given the contract. It's total corruption. And this guy's he's French. He's a French and Belgian man background, I think. And his bulldozers and his power equipment was used to bury the refugees that didn't survive in the Kisangani region when they were all massacred back in 1996-97. The RPF, the Rwandan Patriotic Front, meaning the president of Rwanda, sent his people in, the RPF, and I think Kagame was nearby, the president, and Museveni from Uganda sent their people in and chased these refugees across the region. So here's Uganda, and here's tiny little Rwanda and Burundi, and Kisangani is somewhere, the bend in the river. I think it's here. What? Up here. Anyway, it's in there. And the point is that it's very deep in the Congo. And they can get their raw materials in and out, and they ship their raw materials out during the war with the airplanes that brought in the weapons on the reverse trip. Just like you see, I think it's in, does that happen in Darwin's Nightmare? I'm not sure. Anyway, it's hot in here. Or am I just talking too much? Is anybody falling asleep? No. So, here's Idi Amin. We have to back up to understand what happened in Rwanda by starting in Uganda with Idi Amin. Anybody see Last King of Scotland? Just one? Two? Three? Couple? Hollywood. Idi Amin is the, he's in the middle, by the way. And the other guy is Gaddafi. He's the premier African dictator. When they hold up an example of savagery in Africa, it's either him or Samuel Doe. He put his heads of people in refrigerators, we were told, to keep them cool. And Samuel Doe cut off the ears of, or the other way around. It was Doe and Charles Taylor, whatever. But back in the 1970s, Amin took power with the help of Israel, Britain, and the United States. And after a few years, he wasn't doing what they wanted anymore. And eventually, he was overthrown by the guy on the right, Museveni, who's in power in Uganda today. Yoweri Museveni seized power from 1980 to 1986 through a guerrilla movement which committed the same kind of atrocities that we saw or were seen, I didn't see, that some people saw, in Rwanda from 1990 to 1994, and the same kinds of atrocities that were committed after that in Congo and still being committed in Uganda, Rwanda, and Congo, because Museveni is still in power in Uganda, and he's still in power in, Kagame, of course, is still in power in Rwanda. Now, the guy on the far left is the director of a corporation called Unilever, and Museveni is giving the thumbs up to Unilever Corporation in Uganda. Unilever is one of the corporations that brought Museveni to power and has supported power struggles all over Africa for raw materials since way back in the I think lever plantations began in the Congo around 1910. This is powerful British money. What's interesting here is that Unilever also owns a company called Ben & Jerry's, which makes ice cream, which is considered to be green. And Unilever also owns a company called Calvin Klein. But anyway, just one of the companies that backed Museveni. Now, you can't separate what's going on in Uganda from what's going on in Sudan. So here you are at the border of Lokochokio, which you see in the movie about the pharmaceuticals in Kenya. What's that movie? What? In The Constant Gardener. Fantastic, yeah. In The Constant Gardener, you see this place called Lokochokio, way up in the northern Kenya. And what's important here is that the rise of I'm talking about the rise of the refugee sector, the rise of the humanitarian sector, the growth market of saving people's lives, supposedly, began in roughly in the 1960s. You know, the first aid agency we can think of was that woman who sewing the flag back in the Revolutionary War? They have a red cross. What? Betsy Ross, right. The Red Cross, wasn't it? Anyway, the aid organizations burgeoned into force after 1960 in Africa, because so did the dictatorships and the coup d'etats, and so did the forcing people off land into vast refugee camps, which were otherwise known as concentration camps, because you concentrate the people together, then you have the opportunity to control them, to survey them, to monitor them, to market them, or market to them. And ultimately, you have the opportunity to ship them somewhere else or eliminate them. Now, there's a guy in the room who survived that process of elimination when the aid agencies created these vast camps in eastern Congo, and the Rwandan Patriotic Front marched in and bombed them, which is a war crime. But this wasn't the first of the RPF's war crimes. Anyway, up in Sudan, this vast infrastructure of aid developed called second blank tonight. A big network of aid organizations. There were like 210 or 410 aid organizations connected to this network that was operating in South Sudan, because in South Sudan you had a war from 1980 to, well, basically to the present. And from 1990 onward, the United States, through Museveni in Uganda, supported the war in South Sudan by shipping in weapons covertly. We also have the big market of food, so-called food, which, if the fellow who survived those slaughters in the Congo would like to speak about, what they were actually fed by the aid organizations is not by any stretch of the imagination what you could call food. The closest thing to provision of food in Africa is the World Food Program. You look into their connections to a guy named Jesse Helms and some other powerful Republicans in the United States government, you find out that they're very closely connected to what happens with a company called Archers Daniels Midland, who's the biggest funder of National Public Radio. And Archers Daniels Midland and Barack Obama, and they're connected to the grain belt. So we're talking about markets for the United States food. We're not talking about feeding people in Africa. We're talking about protectionism. We're talking about making sure that grain prices rise when we need them to rise. And if we have to leave our grain in the silo and let it rot, we do that. And then when it's rotten, it's packaged up, sent off to the World Food Program as food, and shipped off to Africa to get a big tax write-off for Archers Daniels Midland and those farmers in Nebraska. I mean, you start looking into that. Nobody's unpacked that story. The closest thing you can come to it is perhaps Darwin's Nightmare, which I haven't actually seen. And there's a fantastic book called The Road to Hell by Michael Marin, who I was hoping would show up tonight. He's not here, is he? Anyway, he wrote The Road to Hell, and it's about the aid industry and Save the Children, and how most of the profits from Save the Children go to Connecticut, and very little goes to the people in Africa, almost nothing. And the corruption. And he just did all this research into Save the Children's corruption in Somalia. So, and we get, you know, this is advertising. It says USA for a reason. It's packaged like that. The media comes in, takes pictures of the food being delivered to these Africans. It's broadcast across the American media, and then the people in Montana or Massachusetts give $20 to Save the Children, or $100 to Save the Children, and then they can forget about Africa. You know, on a certain level. It's very, I'm sure that sounds very cynical. I suppose I'm very cynical. Oh, Christ. Exactly. Here we are back in South Sudan, giving a Bible sermon to the Anuak people who are surviving genocide in Ethiopia, where the United States military bases are blowing off the planet. There's I want to say SUVs, UAVs, unmanned aerospace vehicles, floating over East Africa and the Horn of Africa, sent in by the CIA and by the Pentagon. Now, this is the biggest business of the military corporations today. Unmanned aerospace vehicles and unmanned undersea vehicles are one of the biggest businesses. They're blowing those drones all over the earth now. They're just being sent out everywhere. They're all over the Congo. They're all over Israel. They're all over the Massachusetts coast. They're all over the Mexico border. UAVs are flying over Sudan. And this guy is giving a sermon to these people who are suffering from the genocide being perpetrated by the government of Ethiopia, who's one of the biggest clients of the United States, because he participates in fighting against those nasty Islamic terrorists, which is, of course, the theme. The Sudan People's Liberation Army was backed by the United States from 1990 to 2003, and it's still backed in Darfur under a different name called the Sudan Liberation Army. The weapons went in from Uganda through the guy on the right, President Museveni. When he came to power in 1980 and 1986, one of his left-hand men were Paul Kagame, who was one of the Tutsi Ugandans, in Uganda at the time, a Ugandan citizen. He was not one of the Jews of Africa. He was not people without a country. He was a person who had survived from 1962 when his family fled Rwanda, had grown as a 2-year-old or 3-year-old, or 1959, and he grew up in Rwanda with all the benefits of Rwanda citizenry, with Rwandan passport. I'm sorry, in Uganda with the Ugandan passport, along with all these other Tutsis who fled Rwanda because the Tutsis had been persecuting the Hutus in Rwanda for centuries. And the Hutus finally rose up and said enough in 1959. The Hutus were persecuted by the Tutsis before the Germans came in 1880, and they were persecuted by the Tutsis during the German occupation until 1946 or whatever. And they were persecuted by the Tutsis until 1959 when they finally rose up and said enough, and they threw out the Tutsis, killing a bunch of them at the same time. That's called liberation. But the Tutsis who were in power in Rwanda, this does not mean every Tutsi in Rwanda is responsible for oppression, but the Tutsis who were in power in Rwanda, the autocracy, the dictatorship in power at the time, the monarchy, was controlling the Hutu masses with all kinds of brutal methods. For example, hanging the testicles of a Rwandan Hutu man from their special sacred drum as a symbol to the Hutus to remind them who's in power here. I mean, this was going on. Now, this is skipped when they talk about what happened in Rwanda. It's just those Tutsis were the victims of genocide in 1994, and we have to help them. They're the Jews of Africa. They're a stateless people. There was no history given when it happened in 1994. Philip Gurevich is the guy who wrote this story in New Yorker in 1997. Continental Shift was these guys were marching across the Congo, butchering people, butchering 800,000 Rwandans. Innocent men, women, and children, mostly women and children, 80% women and children under the age of 15. When the UN report on genocide, on atrocities in the Congo, which just was leaked in August and then came out finally on October 1st, it was a 3-year investigation that was established in 2006, I believe, and completed in 2009, but finally leaked in August of 2010. What it says is that RPF, meaning Kagame, possibly committed genocide in the Congo. Now, there's no court that has ruled that genocide has happened in the Congo, so therefore it's not certain that genocide occurred, and we can't say that genocide occurred in the Congo until we actually have a court that rules on that from an official judicial position. But when the Hutus were supposedly committing genocide in Rwanda as early as 1990 or 1991, they were immediately targeted and blamed with genocide by Human Rights Watch. Nobody had to adjudicate